The Graveyard Shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m., during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with a daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened, and tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. But when I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me. His eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me. But instead, he turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house. But the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination. But night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her. But the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, he had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too. making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up. So I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties. So we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story. Buried for decades, the girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister, and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore. It's time to let go and find peace. In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. The stalker in the dark. I'm a carpenter, and I've never liked early mornings, especially when it's still dark outside. That morning, like every other, I woke up at 4:30 a.m., sluggishly making my way to the bus stop. It was winter, so the darkness was thick and the air was freezing. The path from my house led through a small patch of woods. It wasn't long, only about 200 meters, but walking through it always felt endless. Halfway down the path, I heard something the sound of branches cracking underfoot. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling. By the time I reached the bus stop, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Then I saw him, under the dim glow of a streetlight, far off. A man stood hidden by a tree. He wore black pants, and his pale blue jacket made him stand out against the darkness. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the hood of his jacket, but I could feel his gaze. The bus arrived, and relief washed over me. I boarded the empty bus, sat in the back, and glanced out the window toward where he had stood. He was gone. Just as the bus was about to start moving, I heard a thud against the window. Startled, I turned to see a hand outside. The pale blue sleeve was unmistakable. His hand rose, waving toward me. I couldn't see his face through the hoodie, but that hand, it waved slowly, almost mockingly. So, I tried to ignore it and looked away. When I got off the bus, I walked toward the building where I worked to store my belongings. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking if he had followed me. I reached the door, fumbling with my keys, and just as I was about to open it, I saw him again, lurking in the shadows outside the building. I dashed inside, slamming the door behind me. There were 2 more doors inside the building, both requiring a key card to access. There was no way he could get in. My hands shook as I swiped my card and hurried down the dark hallway to the locker room. I made it to the locker room, brewed some coffee, and changed into my work clothes, all while trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. There was no way he could have gotten inside. It was impossible. When my coworkers finally arrived, the fear subsided a bit. Being surrounded by people made me feel safe. We gathered our things and headed up to the top floor to start the day's work. Then, I realized I had forgotten my hard hat in the locker room. I took the elevator down, and the moment the doors opened, that uneasy feeling returned. The hallway was empty, dark, and silent. I grabbed my hard hat and headed back to the elevator. Just then, I heard a voice call my name, Vic. It came from the end of the hallway. I slowly turned around and saw him standing there in the darkness, flashing a twisted grin. Then he said,
"You look so peaceful when you sleep, Vic."
I bolted toward the elevator, frantically pressing the button, praying the doors would close before he reached me. When I reached the top floor, I ran to my coworkers, gasping for breath and trembling. I tried to explain what had happened, but they just laughed and said it was impossible for a stranger to be inside since all the doors required a key card. They didn't believe me. I felt foolish even, embarrassed. I thought about calling the police, but something stopped me, maybe fear, maybe the dread of being ridiculed again. After that day, I never saw the man in the pale blue jacket again, but his words have haunted me ever since. I changed my routine. I stopped walking through the woods to the bus stop and always kept my curtains closed at night. The Motel Nightmare. It was 2016. and I had just started a new job as the night clerk at a small, rundown motel. The pay wasn't great, but I needed the work, and the night shift seemed quiet enough. My friend Michael had trained me, but after just a few nights, I was left to work alone. The motel was in a remote area, surrounded by woods and far from the nearest town. One night, around 1:00 a.m., a man walked in, asking if there were any rooms available. He seemed normal at first, so I checked him in without a second thought. But as I handed him his key, I noticed something strange. He kept swatting at the air, as if surrounded by invisible flies, and making spitting noises. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. He went to his room. I went back to the cashier, and I hoped that would be the end of it. But a few minutes later, he returned, slamming his hand on the glass door. My heart jumped as I looked up to see him glaring at me.
"I can't get into my room,"
he said angrily.
"Why won't you let me in?"
I tried to stay calm and offered to give him a new key, but his behavior was making me nervous. His eyes were wild, and his movements were erratic. I handed him the new key and watched as he trudged back to his room. I should have called the police then, but I didn't want to overreact. A few minutes later, I heard him talking to himself, his voice low and angry. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone sent chills down my spine. Then, clearly and distinctly, I heard him say,
"Kill him. Kill him."
My blood ran cold. Panicking, I locked myself in the back office and grabbed the electric pliers I kept for emergencies. I knew I should call the police, but fear paralyzed me. Instead, I decided to try and defuse the situation myself. I walked back into the lobby, pretending nothing was wrong. The man wasn't there. I heard him outside on the balcony, still muttering to himself. I moved closer to him to see what he was doing out there. Suddenly he turned back with a scary look on his face and looked at me and laughed loudly. He shouted the previous sentence.
"I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me in?"
I forced myself to stay calm and told him I would escort him to his room. He agreed and followed right behind me. I could feel his eyes on my back, and I gripped the electric pliers in my hand, hidden by my sleeve. When we reached his door, I realized he had been trying to get into the wrong room, another guest's room. I quickly unlocked the correct door and let him in, then rushed back to the office, my heart pounding. I watched the security monitors for the rest of my shift, unable to relax. Later that night, a police officer checked in. I confided in him about the man, and he promised to keep an eye out. The next night, the man returned, but I had the doors locked and told him we were full. He left without a fuss, and I never saw him again. I stayed at the motel for another year, but I was always on edge, waiting for the next strange encounter. That night taught me a valuable lesson. Trust your instincts and never hesitate to call for help when you feel unsafe. The elevator of apartment 13. I had just moved into a new apartment building, a towering structure of steel and glass in the heart of the city. The building was modern, with sleek finishes, key card access, and an array of amenities. But what attracted me most was the affordable rent, something almost too good to be true in this part of town. My apartment was on the 13th floor, which didn't bother me despite the superstitions surrounding that number. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was still settling in, getting used to the sounds of the city, and the hum of the building. The neighbors were quiet, and I rarely saw anyone in the hallways or elevator. However, I began to notice something strange about the elevator itself. Every time I used it, it seemed to take longer to reach my floor, and there was always a strange clicking noise just before the doors opened. One evening, after a long day at work, I stepped into the elevator, ready to unwind in my apartment. The elevator was empty, as usual, and I pressed the button for the 13th floor. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the elevator began its ascent. As I leaned back against the wall, I felt the familiar sensation of the elevator moving, but then, abruptly, it stopped. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its screen as a makeshift flashlight. The elevator jolted, and the lights came back on, dimmer than before.
Help me!
The floor indicator showed that I was between the 12th and 13th floors. I pressed the buttons repeatedly, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the elevator began to descend slowly, as if under someone else's control. The air grew thick, and I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like something heavy was pressing down on me. The clicking noise started again, louder this time, echoing through the small space. I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. The elevator stopped on the 10th floor, and the doors opened. I peered out into the hallway, which was eerily dark, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. My instincts told me to get out, but something held me back. There was a presence in the hallway, something unseen but undeniably there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I quickly pressed the closed door button, my hands trembling. The doors shut, and the elevator continued its descent, but the clicking noise didn't stop. It was almost rhythmic now, like footsteps above me. I stared at the ceiling, fear gripping me as the noise grew louder and faster. The elevator stopped again, this time on the 8th floor. The doors creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, just out of the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. The temperature in the elevator plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I slammed my hand on the buttons, desperate to get the elevator moving again, but it refused to respond. The shadow began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. Just as it reached the threshold of the elevator, the doors snapped shut, and the elevator plunged downward, faster than before. I held onto the railing, my heart pounding in my ears. The clicking noise was now deafening, as if whatever was in the elevator shaft was right above me, following me. The elevator stopped suddenly, the doors opening to the lobby. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and looked back just in time to see the shadowy figure standing in the elevator, its hand outstretched as if reaching for me. The doors closed, and the elevator ascended again, disappearing into the darkness of the shaft. Shaken, I reported the incident to the building management, but they found nothing wrong with the elevator. I moved out the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in that elevator, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the living. To this day, I avoid elevators, especially in old buildings, and I'll never forget the feeling of that cold, oppressive presence in the apartment building of 13. It was a reminder that some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by something far more sinister.